Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the National Center for Rural Road Safety's October webinar. My name is Jamie Sullivan. I'm the Director for the Rural Road Safety Center. We're going to get started now. Today's webinar will be called A Review of the Effectiveness of Mitigation Measures that Seek to Reduce Wildlife Vehicle Collisions. And first, I'm going to give you a little bit of background about who's joining us. It looks like we have about 80% of you who are joining us on your own. And then we do have, as always, a few groups, about 16%, which have a group of 2 to 3 people, and about 2% with groups of 4 to 5 people. And then we have at least one group that has 10 and up in it. We also have a pretty good mix of organizations being represented today. It looks like we have about 8% from Federal Transportation Department, about 33% from the state DOT, about 14% from local DOTs. We have about 4% from local technical assistance programs, about 2% from public lands agencies, 12% from other federal, state, or local government agency, and 4% from educational institutions, 2% from professional associations, and about 12% private consultants, and then a few that didn't fit into any of those categories. We also have, as far as geography, we have about 9% of you joining us from the Northeast, about 13% from the Southeast, about 32% from the Midwest, about 39% from Western U.S., and 6.5% from other locations. And most of you, as always, are joining us on the computer only, about 80%, and the rest of you are joining us both by computer and phone. And we'll go over a few instructions as I move us over to our main presentation for all of you about how you are joining us. Okay, so just a few of those webinar logistics I was mentioning. The duration of today's webinar will be an hour and a half. The webinar is being recorded so that it can be archived on our website. It will be available within a few days. For quality of the recording, we have muted everyone's phone lines for the presentation. Because of this, if you are joining us by computer only, if you do have any audio issues, we would ask you to call in. The phone number can be found in the top left-hand corner of your screen. You are also able to chat with our WTI staff members who can also help you with any audio issues, but sometimes it's generally the Wi-Fi that you're on. So again, if you do have issues, we would suggest you try calling in first. If you are listening on the phone, we would ask you to please mute your computer speakers, otherwise you may hear feedback. If there are some graphics that you'd like to see larger, in the top right-hand corner of your screen, there are 4 arrows that point outward. If you click on that button, it will make your PowerPoint itself full screen and get rid of all of the boxes on the left and the bottom for you. At the end of each section we have today, and there will be 3 sections, there will be time for question and answer. And as always, for those of you who have joined us before, we'll also have some poll questions for the audience as well. At the bottom of your screen in the left-hand corner, you can find the handout pod. There you will find a PDF version of today's PowerPoint, and you can feel free to download that. We will also have that posted on our website with the streaming link of this webinar within a few days as well. And then I do want to remind everyone that we do follow-up surveys following the webinars. If you are one of those people in a group, if you could please send us names and email addresses to info, I-N-F-O, at ruralsafetycenter.org so we can make sure that everyone in that room gets the email with the survey link. This will be the only way that you can request CEUs for today's webinar. And so for the CEUs, I'm showing the link as well right now on your screen, just in case you don't receive it. Sometimes our emails from Constant Contact do end up in people's junk mailboxes. So this link is provided right here. You can also find it again in that PDF version in the handout pod in the bottom left. The last 2 questions of the survey do ask about whether or not you'd like a certificate of completion and CEUs. The surveys close about 2 weeks after the webinar, and you can expect to receive it in your inbox directly following the close of today's webinar. The certificates and CEU form take about 4 to 6 weeks as we do manually create and email all of those out. If you were interested in the CEUs, we just ask that you fill out that form and email it back to continuinged@montana.edu and not to the Rural Safety Center. The Continuing Education Department at Montana State University does handle all of that for us. You may also request a verification of completion form. So on your screen right now, top left hand, you'll see what an example form looks like that you'll be asked to fill out. And bottom right corner will show you the verification of completion form if you request one. That will show you all of the CEUs you've ever been provided by Montana State University. So any of the webinars that you've attended that were ours or either of our summits as well. I do want to remind everyone as well, all of the recorded webinars that are available on our website, you can request CEUs and certificates of completion for those as well. There is a separate survey link that is underneath the link for each of those streaming webinars. So if you've ever watched any of those after the fact, you can find them there as well. And today's presenter, we have Rob Ament. He is the Road Ecology Program Manager for the Western Transportation Institute at Montana State University. And we're very excited to have him here with us today. I'm going to read his bio to you guys in just one second. Rob has more than 30 years of experience in transportation ecology, natural resource management, and environmental policy. At WTI, Rob leads our efforts to research, monitor, and develop solutions to minimize the impacts of roads on terrestrial and aquatic wildlife and improve motorist safety. He is the principal investigator of 5 active research projects and oversees 6 staff in 3 offices in Western North America. Some of the active research projects he leads, including developing a national roadkill data collection system for the National Park Service and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, a reservation-wide wildlife vehicle collision reduction plan for the Blackfeet Nation of Montana, and a mitigation plan to provide safe passage for elephants, tigers, and rhinos across a proposed 4-lane highway adjacent to a national park in Assam, India. In the past year, he has conducted road ecology workshops for the Hopi Tribe in Arizona, the Yukon Territories government, Canada, and for tiger conservationists in India and Nepal. And we're very excited to have Rob here today to talk to us about 3 of the projects that they currently have going on. The goal of today's webinar is that once you've completed this webinar, you will have the latest information on the relative effectiveness of mitigation measures that seek to reduce animal vehicle collisions by reviewing a preliminary results of the Transportation Pooled Fund Project, Wildlife Vehicle Collision Reduction and Habitat Connectivity Study. To do this, the 4 learning outcomes we have for you today are to identify the 3 strategies developed to reduce AVCs and the types of mitigation measures that fit under each strategy, to know which of the 28 countermeasures are most effective and which are not, to understand the importance of differentiating between crashes with livestock and wildlife, and to more fully appreciate the costs of doing nothing to mitigate animal vehicle collisions versus the benefits that accrue when countermeasures are deployed. And at this time, I would like to hand over our webinar to Rob so that he can begin the presentation. Rob?
Great. Thank you, Jamie. Good morning, everyone on the West Coast, and good afternoon to those in the East. So I appreciate the opportunity to share with you some of our more recent findings. Some have just been completed, and others are about to be completed. So most of the information I'll be sharing is relatively new. Let's see if I'm under control. I'll just do a couple of slides to give you a brief overview on animal vehicle collisions. And this is the common statistics everyone's using right now, 1 to 2 million collisions with large mammals in the U.S., which results in about 29,000 human injuries per year and around 200 fatalities. And the estimated direct cost to society at $8 billion. And also because of some species being listed under the Endangered Species Act, about 22 are threatened or endangered. As a result, one of the criteria was road mortality. And this is this is the most recent, and it's over 10 years old, the national study that we conducted here, a team of us at WTI. And from that study, we looked at 15 years of crash data across the U.S. and found that although overall crashes stayed relatively the same for 15 years, on the bottom, the wildlife vehicle collisions had actually gone up about 50%. So overall, it's about, in the databases, the national databases, it's about 5% of all collisions are with animals. And then, even though we say 1 to 2 million nationwide, we realize that there's a lot of underreporting of data of actual collisions. And these are some of the most recent studies that looked at the databases. And then in British Columbia, they had 4 different databases. And then when they threw all the replicates out, they compared it. And the Ministry of it's called the Ministry of Transportation for British Columbia. Their database, actually, there were 3 times more crashes than what they were identifying in their database. Even the insurance industry, there were over 2 times as many crashes as what they had in their database. So even more recently, here stateside in Virginia, a study comparing law enforcement or crash data for the state versus actually going out and collecting information, they found it was 8.5 times higher than what the DOT has in their database. And the actual costs were 6 times higher than what were being recorded. And then for smaller animals, those species, again, that are potentially listed as threatened and endangered, a recent study in the United Kingdom identified about 6 times underreporting of small mammals. Of course, they're being scavenged, and so they disappear quicker than the large mammals. So the bottom line from this whole story is that even though we're talking 1 to 2 million, it's certainly many times more that are actually occurring on U.S. roadways. So I first want to talk, part 1 of my talk will be the effectiveness of the AVC reduction mitigation measures. And this is a result of an international pooled fund study. It's administered by the Nevada Department of Transportation. There were 8 states that joined them, but also Ontario Province and Parks Canada agencies. So basically 2 Canadian organizations and 8 U.S. DOTs. And we are the Task 1 team at WTI, and you can see all those names. We have quite a diverse group of team members. And what I'm going to be discussing today is the findings from one of the very first things we did under Task 1, which was to review the effectiveness of mitigation measures. So and then after, I just want to state that this is a study that's in review. When I first set up this talk, I thought it would be done by now, but it's taken a little bit longer. So just keep in mind these are preliminary findings. And we broke the mitigation measures into 3 different strategies. The first one is mitigation measures that try to influence driver behavior to reduce collisions. The second one is to influence animal behavior near the road or their relative population size. And then the third one is to separate animals from the road so that basically vehicles and animals don't mix. And so the first mitigation strategy is to influence driver behavior. And I might remind everyone, we know how difficult this is when we simply think of high-risk things drivers do, even though they know better. And we have been after them to try to change their driver behavior from texting and driving and drinking and driving. And so we know even getting drivers to try to change their behavior to reduce wildlife vehicle collisions is a difficult task. And so one thing that almost everyone does is try to educate and inform the public about different facets of wildlife vehicle collisions or animal vehicle collisions. And there are very few studies, if any, that have really quantified how effective public education campaigns are. There's things like don't veer for deer or give wildlife a break, everything from bumper stickers to billboards along highways, but we could find very little evidence that the public education is actually reducing wildlife vehicle collisions. However, it doesn't mean it's a bad idea not to keep bringing this to the attention of motorists in your state or province. And then, of course, we see these all over our highways wherever we drive, which are standard wildlife or vehicle collision sites or warning signs. And the standard signs, as we know, are so common that they basically have 0% effectiveness. However, if we take the standard signs and enhance them or put them up seasonally, particularly, say, in the west where you have migrations crossing the highway at certain times of the year, we found that that does go from 0% from up to 9 to 50%. So in certain locations, at certain times where you put the signs up and remove them, they can be partially effective, at least in almost half. You can reduce it in that particular road segment. And we looked far and wide, and this is the actual only publication in the literature that showed that a public education with a standard sign could actually get a reduction in wildlife vehicle collisions. Celso Poot from Belize came and visited us and stayed with us for 6 weeks and was working on his master's. He happens to be the conservation director for the Belize Zoo, so he's very good at public education, has access to educate the public that most people don't. And as a result, he did publish his paper and found that from around 3 crashes per year, that he reduced the mortality to just 1 tapir. It's the Baird's tapir, which is a red-listed species. So that's the only one we could find. Then the other thing that influences driver behavior could be using animal detection systems that detect the animal and then usually turn on flashing lights to warn the driver. They are very specific locations on the road. That's where they're most effective. And the technology has advanced. 10 years ago on that national study, over 10 years ago, they were quite low, but they've increased significantly as the detection systems have become more sophisticated. However, changing the driver behavior component, so the detection is much more effective, and changing driver behavior to reduce the collisions, I'll discuss in a little bit more detail. But you can see it can vary quite widely from 33 to 97%. And the 97% study was just at a fence end. They had 6 underpasses with continuous fencing between the structures, but at the end of the treatment they had animal detection systems. So it was very local, right at the edge of both ends of the fence. And it was quite effective then. And so there's a whole bunch of different systems that they're developing based on laser, infrared. If you can see on the Yellowstone sign, I don't know if you can see my pointer, but this is the detection system, and they send a beam along parallel to the highway. And what we've found is that the shorter the distance, the less false positives you'll get. In other words, sagebrush, tumbleweed could go through there and set off the lights, or heavy snows can set off the lights by breaking that beam. So the closer those beams are together, the more effective they are. And so once those lights go on, how effective is it in changing driver behavior, meaning slowing down? And this was from a study from that Yellowstone system. And you can see when the lights on the left during the day, when the lights would flip on, drivers on average would slow down from about 59 miles an hour down to a little over 56 miles per hour. So you're seeing 3 miles per hour reduction in speed. And just so you know, that's a 55 mile an hour zone, so they're still above the speed limit, both in the day and as well at nighttime. So you're only, even though you may have an effective detection system, you're still not getting quite the driver behavior change that will help preclude animal-vehicle collisions. So instead of having roadside detection, what's changing nowadays, especially as more development in autonomous vehicles, are detection systems on board. And so they're using a whole suite of different sensors, from LiDAR, infrared types of sensors to identify wildlife, as well as pedestrians and bicyclists too. So they're getting quite sophisticated, and there's a lot of investment in these technologies. However, when we looked, we could not find in the literature, we could find lots of studies that showed how effective they were at detecting the animal, but not the other part of the equation, which was if they did detect the animal accurately, what kind of reductions were we seeing in animal-vehicle collisions. And so therefore, we have very little information, even though if you see on the bottom right of this screen, many companies, especially the more expensive models of the different automakers, actually have either active or passive systems. And by an active onboard system, it means that when the computer in the car determines that there's an animal, it will actually put the brakes on for the driver. Passive system, it just shows you the animal and it leaves it up to the driver to slow down or avoid the animal. And as we know, to replace the whole fleet in the U.S. takes about 20 years. So many people may not want to wait to have these onboard detection systems. And just so you know, they're actually making ones. If you want to put it in your car tomorrow, you can go onto Amazon or whatever and buy a commercial system that has a screen on your dashboard and a sensor that you put on your front bumper with a cable and some computer chips, and you can put these into your car, and so you don't have to wait or buy an expensive model. I just looked up today what these cost. They're about $2,500. So again, the cost may be prohibitive to get the entire fleet in the U.S. Trending towards having these systems on board. So there's other ways we try to influence driver behavior, and one is particularly for because a lot of the crashes, over 50% of the crashes are in the dark, that we improve lighting. And you can see it's really hard to, as you know, driving at night to identify an animal and to brake in time. So when you actually put lights, like street lights up along the highway, it is quite effective actually. The problem is we know we can't treat all the problem areas with lights, and sometimes lights are problematic for other species and also just light pollution in general. So maybe for very specific cases where you have problems, lighting may be a solution because it does get over a 50% reduction in animal vehicle collisions. The other type of things you can do to allow drivers more time to react to the presence of a large animal along a road is to trim the vegetation back away from the road. And so it gives you more reaction time as a driver, and you have to brush it out and cut down the trees and mow it on a regular basis. But the results so far have been somewhat mixed, and they've all been under 50% reduction. And also it may be affecting other species that need more forest cover to feel comfortable in that habitat. So anyhow, it has been tried in many different countries as well, not just in the U.S., but no one has gotten results that have been over 50%. Then the other notion is to take the stripes along the side of the road and paint those wider so that when an animal crosses that stripe, it becomes more evident to the drivers. Again, this works much better for nighttime drivers. But again, there's very little scientific evidence that this works, but it is thought of as a type of measure that could be tried, again, for specific areas where striping wouldn't disrupt normal traffic. The other idea, particularly for livestock, is to increase their visibility. Almost one of our studies in Montana, I think livestock collisions, over 80% of all collisions with livestock are at night. And so increasing their visibility, and we know that when you do it, increase bicyclists and pedestrians, they were getting nearly a 50% reduction. So there's the notion of they actually sell reflective ear tags. So if livestock already have an ear tag, it would be a very simple swap out to put in reflective ear tags for animals on open range. And the other thing is that for livestock that don't have ear tags, to simply buy a pair is like, I think they're $2.50 when we looked online for them. So it's a very simple solution. We have developed a proposal to research this because it hasn't been studied, but it would be a very cost-effective treatment if it would work out. Then the other one is to reduce traffic volume, and this is a mixed bag that the lower your traffic is, the less animal vehicle collisions you have. That would mean putting the traffic onto other roads, which would increase traffic there, so it's somewhat complicated. But the theory is the less vehicles, the less collisions with animals, large animals, but it's not necessarily a linear relationship. And by that, what is meant is that as traffic volumes increase, it becomes more and more barrier effect, and at some point, animals will no longer even try to cross the road if there's too much traffic. And then seasonal road closures, these are primarily for like park managers, wildlife refuges, or other just very seasonal and local issues, primarily with smaller animals, where you close the road during their migration or breeding season, and they're actually 100% effective. So they work very well, but of course closing a road is fraught with other management problems. And then the other very simple thing to do is reduce posted speed limits. And I wish I could report that it's really cheap and it's really effective. But however, it's actually quite a complex issue. And that is most drivers, as you well know, drive what the road is designed for, not what's posted on the sign next to the road. And so commonly you can post whatever you want and drivers will still drive what they feel safe driving at. Law enforcement changes that equation a bit, but they're not always on all these roads all the time. So it's relatively sporadic effectiveness. Then the next part is called speed dispersion. So if you have a slower speed limit sign, some people will follow it. And so you'll have slower moving vehicles mixed with people who are driving the design speed. And so it tends to get more vehicle-to-vehicle collisions when you have this mix of slow and fast vehicles. So it is the notion of just reducing the speed to reduce animal-vehicle collisions is somewhat complicated. And the same thing at posting lower speed limits at night. That's also trying to reduce the risk because lower speeds give drivers more time to react. However, the driver compliance with these reduced speeds is very low. I know Colorado had a 2-year experiment to reduce speeds in wildlife corridors with mixed results as an example. And there was just a recent study, so 3 of our pooled fund team members, Corinna, Elizabeth, and Marcel, just finished a report for the Wyoming Department of Transportation about reducing nighttime speeds. And they basically found that they posted the speed down to 55 from 70 at night in these tests in their experiment, and yet drivers only slowed down 3 to 5 miles per hour. So they were down to 65 to 67 miles per hour at night. And so there was no evidence that there was lower deer vehicle collisions. And they're recommending structural mitigation instead of just signage. And the rationale for this, when we start looking at slowing people down, especially at night, so just using Wyoming as an example, at 70 miles an hour, you need 491 feet to see the animal and then apply the brakes and stop the car. At 55, you need 346 feet. And if you look below that, the standard headlight only runs out about 150 to 200 feet. And even at high beam, it's 250 to 350 feet. So in Wyoming, they got vehicles to go to 67 miles an hour or needing 460 feet. Both of those at high beam or low beam are still, you're exceeding your headlights, so the braking distance. So you're basically not improving the chances of reducing the collisions at all. On high beams, at 55, at least you start getting a little, at 346 feet. On high beam, needing up to 350 feet, you might be getting a little bit of an effective treatment there. And then the other thing we can do for traffic calming is to put in speed bumps. Usually we don't do this on our major highways. It might be on roads through natural areas, again through maybe federal lands, parks, refuges, and those type of areas. And you do get a reduction. They're quite effective because you can slow vehicles down to about, depending on the spacing of the bumps, 10, 15 miles an hour. But it's a very local treatment. So, but it is effective, relatively effective at 50%. So in summary, when one looks at trying to change the driver behavior, which we know admittedly is a difficult thing, the roadside animal detection systems are improving and getting better, and actually could be deployed, makes sense to deploy in particular areas. And seasonal closures work, and then in the yellow under effectiveness, so up to 50%, but not are usually the seasonal wildlife warning signs and maybe road lighting in particular areas, and some vegetation treatment as well if you have really heavy forested area close to the road. So, and then reducing the speed with speed bumps also is relatively effective. But all of these, except for reducing traffic volume or seasonal closure, actually also reduce the connectivity or the ability of all animals to get across that road. So they don't necessarily solve the connectivity issue, but they do reduce the collision or treat the collision issue. The second thing is to try to change animal behavior. We know what training wildlife is like. It's very difficult, and so one can pretty much guess that trying to change the animals is very difficult and is hard to make effective. One thing to do that has been attempted is using visual or audio signals along the roadside. All of these studies are very mixed results. And I'll give you an example. We actually had team members finish a study. This one again was in Wyoming, and the three that I mentioned earlier did this study as well. We're on the team, and they put in the reflector lights. Let me go back real quick. And that's sort of set up like this, where the headlights hit the reflector, and it goes back and forth among reflectors. So only while the vehicles are present do the reflectors then supposedly warn the animals and at least freeze them up in the bright lights of the headlights being reflected. And so they did a study on this, and the company reported really high levels of reductions, but the YDOT study found about a 32% reduction. And that was what was the interesting thing is part of their experiment was to cover the reflectors with white bags as they varied the treatment from time to time so that they could see the difference between reflectors and no reflectors. And actually the white bag coverage was twice as effective as the reflector lights themselves. So very confusing results, and they aren't quite sure why. But anyhow, that's a relatively inexpensive treatment, and you can get up to a 30% reduction. The other ones are these whistles that you put on the bumpers of your car. The good news is they're very inexpensive. I looked online, and I think you can get them for $10. The bad news is that's even $10 that doesn't really change animal behavior or make them not approach the road. So these are fairly ineffective, cheap but ineffective. And then repellents, again, this would be for very local treatments. And you can spray it on the vegetation or along the road. And actually, you can get a bit of a reduction in animal vehicle collisions using these deterrents for animals to be around the road, and especially to stay around the road. But they also may be creating a barrier because then animals don't want to even approach that, let alone cross the road. So anyhow, it at least has a partially effective measure, and it needs to be deployed in a very local manner. The other one is adverse conditioning. This is used for problem animals, either through hazing or adversive conditioning. Of course, bears, it's quite common. They've also tried this with bison and other species as well. I know a fellow in Alberta who would take, he was with their fish and game department, and he'd get called to bring his dogs out when bighorn sheep approached the road, and then he'd let the dogs out and they'd push the bighorn sheep back. And he said after a month, all he had to do is show up with his truck, and the bighorn sheep started moving back. The problem is it was only effective when he was available. So it was very spotty, and ultimately it was abandoned. But that's the notion of adverse conditioning, and there is very little evidence it's going to work alongside roads. The other thing is when you have known migrations or wildlife congregate at certain times of the year, you can actually put volunteers out, or some staff in national parks sometimes will show up when animals are trying to get across roads to basically slow vehicles down or stop them while individuals or herds move across the road. Then another issue for those in the northern climates is de-icing alternatives, because salt, many animals are always coming in, not only just ungulates, but the smaller mammals as well. And in Maine, of course, they have salt pools which have been studied, which attract moose, and the salt pools near the road. And so they've at least came up with a model that showed that by treating the salt pools, you could reduce moose vehicle collisions by over 50%. But the actual effect of road salt itself is poorly studied and poorly understood at this time. The other way you could try to dissuade animals from congregating along roads is to remove vegetation and or plant undesirable species in the right-of-way. Again, this is a treatment that seems to make sense, but has not been studied, nor has it been deployed that widely that we could find in the literature. So we don't know quite how well this works. The other one is intercept feeding away from the road. This is where you could either put food or salt blocks so the animals don't come to the road but stay far enough away from the road. Again, it's poorly understood. Recently, I know Nevada has a feral horse or wild horse issues with collisions, and they're allowing some of the conservation groups that love wild horses to do some intercept feeding. So they're trying that. Again, we haven't found anything published at this time to better understand if intercept feeding is going to work, but we do know there's a project moving forward in Nevada. And then this is more of an idea than an actual study that we've found, but the notion is if you have 4-lane highways, instead of having all the lanes close together, which would deter animals or they'd be exposed on the road for a long time, that you would widen the median so they'd have a refuge between. They'd only have to cross 2 lanes, and then they'd have time to regroup and then cross the next 2 lanes. However, again, it hasn't been well studied, or there's nothing that's been published that we could find. The other notion, this is particularly an issue with white-tailed deer, where their populations and densities are unusually high. Sometimes cities are culling. I've heard of both Cedar Rapids, Iowa, for example, or Helena, Montana. I think Helena used sharpshooters, while Cedar Rapids used law enforcement officers to reduce deer populations within city limits in both locales. And actually reducing deer population densities can be an effective tool. Again, it might be in certain locations, maybe in suburban and urban locations primarily, and out in the rural areas with a lot of the wildlife will just fill voids if you reduce a population. Immigrants will just restore what you've treated. So anyhow, it has been shown to be somewhat effective, actually 50% or greater, so it is a viable treatment. And then there's the anti-fertility treatment. Again, this is for very local populations. What the research really found was instead of using it to reduce the population, it was better to use culling to reduce the population and then to use the anti-fertility to maintain the smaller population. And again, this has to treat populations where no immigrants can freely move into into the population you're treating. Otherwise, it defeats the purpose. So again, it hasn't been very well studied for how that then equates into the reduction of animal-vehicle collisions. So to change animal behavior, you can see there's only really one in the green category, which means it's effective. Almost 50 to 84% was wildlife culling. Then a couple of the other types of mitigation measures, the repellents, relocating wildlife, or antifertility, can be used in special areas or special locations, or with a particular herd that is a isolated or closed population. And then lastly, the third mitigation strategy is to separate animals from the road and from the drivers in the vehicles. And of course, fences are quite effective. Boulders, walls, fences, anything that keeps the animals off the road. It's a huge reduction of 80 to 100%. The issue is then if you use fences alone, as most of you know, then there's no connectivity, there's no movement, and you basically start creating isolated populations, splitting populations and isolating them. So that's why using fences alone might be for a specific area, but as a general practice is frowned upon by wildlife agencies. And so the other way to not only separate the animals from the road, but allow for the connectivity is to use underpasses and overpasses with fencing. And again, this is highly effective, 80 to 100% reductions, and it promotes habitat connectivity. It also not only treats large animals, but small animals can use the very same crossings built to reduce the safety issue of large animal vehicle collisions. So this is where everything is pretty much green or yellow when you use fences and structures because they're very effective. But we do want to note that location is really important where you place these, and how long the fences are to gather the animals or direct the animals to the structures are important factors in making it highly effective. And then, of course, fences, if you use them alone, basically cut up the landscape or disconnect both sides of the road's habitats for the use of wildlife. So there are many types of mitigation measures I reviewed. We're trying to look at ones that are highly effective, which we're green lighting them. Ones that make sense, may not be highly effective, but are effective enough that they should be used in certain areas or for certain periods of time before the long-term solution can be implemented. And then there are ones that it may be cheap to use those measures or to deploy them, but they aren't very effective, so we red lighted those. So when we're done with this publication, it'll be available once it's completed, and all of these and even other additional mitigation measures, I couldn't cover all 30 of them today, will be in there for your review and use. So that sort of sums up this first component.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Rob. At this point, we are going to move you guys over and ask a poll question to you, but I do want to remind you that because your phone lines are muted, you can put any poll questions or any questions you may have, in the chat pod on the left-hand side of your screen, and after we do this poll question, I will read those to Rob and have him answer them. So the question that we have for you guys as the audience is the 3 strategies to reduce animal vehicle collisions include influence driver behavior, influence animal behavior or population size, and separate animals from the road. True, false, I don't know, or I don't remember. I'll just give you guys a second to fill that out. Okay, it does look like everyone's had a second to fill that out. So Rob, you should be able to see the results right now if you want to address that, and then I'll start asking you some of the questions that came in.
So I get to put gold stars on everyone's collar. That 97% said yes, true. Those are the 3 strategies that I did cover. So the answer was true.
So the first question that we have for you, Rob, is have there been any efforts to reduce the need for animals to cross roads, for example, by reconnecting food sources, water, and habitat cover that might be fragmented on different sides of the highway?
That's an interesting question. So part of the answer to that is that it has to be a partnership, given the DOTs maintain the right-of-way, but a lot of the habitat sits outside the right-of-way. So it would be like a partnership between those who manage the land adjacent to the road and the DOT. And to do that, to tell you the truth, I don't know of an active project that's attempting to connect things on either side of the road so they're less inclined to cross the road.
Okay, perfect. Our next question for you is, are there any statistics on drivers' fatalities and serious injuries caused by them avoiding hitting a large animal, but ending up hitting a fixed object like a mature tree or rocks and boulders?
Actually, that's a research question that a couple people have been asking about. Someone I've talked to at Federal Highways Administration, that the errant car going off the road, because they don't necessarily, in the safety data, you can't necessarily determine of all the errant vehicles that had crashes why they left the road. It just says they left the road. And so it would, we've always thought of one way you could at least get an idea of whether that's true or not, we thought, is looking at where the errant vehicle crashes are located and compare those to where your wildlife vehicle collision hotspots are. And if there's a high probability that errant vehicles are in those hotspots, one could probably conclude, again, with further evidence and further digging, that that many of the errant vehicles indeed are because of avoiding wildlife. The simpler answer is if you could have that collected at the site during the crash, then we'd have a database on it.
So the next one is more of a comment than a question, and that is that for some DOTs like Virginia, they have a hard time meeting the criteria for installing deer crossing warning signs based on 5 car animal collisions per year and not on reported sightings. The next question that we have for you is, what do you mean by the barrier effect?
Sure. So animals are sensitive to traffic movement, vehicle movement, the noise that's created, and sort of the hustle and bustle, I'll say just sort of in common vernacular, of a busy road. And so some animals won't even approach the road, let alone cross it. Other animals, so that's a barrier effect. They won't actually feel safe to move across the road. They're reacting to traffic. Other species may not want to be, again, like forest-dwelling species or smaller species that might be vulnerable to, say, hawks or raptors, feel very exposed if they're moving in an open area for, across 4 lanes and the right-of-ways that are mowed, because they're totally exposed to that situation, and they haven't evolved to go into meadows, for example, let alone right-of-ways. So again, the physical presence of the opening of the road creates a barrier effect. So traffic can be a barrier, or the road itself can be a barrier for various species to move across the road. If traffic increases, it tends to create less opportunities for animals to get between vehicles as they pass. And so that's where, as more and more traffic occurs on a road, it becomes more and more of a barrier because there's less opportunity. And I'll give a quick example. They put up pneumatic tubes on the highway next to Glacier National Park, and they had collared grizzly bears. This is John Waller. He's a biologist for Glacier. And they found that as soon as 100 vehicles per hour were on the road, they didn't ever find a collared grizzly bear ever cross the road. And the only time they had 100 vehicles per hour or less was at night. So the road's a total barrier in the day when it has high traffic levels, and it becomes open again or permeable in the evening hours, and that's when bears are crossing. So that's sort of, some roads are partial barriers, some are complete barriers, depending on traffic levels.
Okay, we're going to do one more question, and then we'll have you keep presenting just to make sure we get through the end of the presentation. Any questions that are remaining, we'll try and address at the next section. And if there are any questions that remain at the end of today's webinar, I will have Rob provide those answers, and we will email them out with a thank you email to everyone who's attended, as well as posting those along with the streaming link of the webinar. So again, if we run out of time to answer all of these, we will make sure you do get your answers. So the last question we'll address right now is, what if animals or people mistake the reflective lights as the eyes of other animals? So I believe they're talking about the reflective tags that you were talking about on livestock.
So when cars are on the road and they light up the ear tags with their headlights, I'm trying to get a handle on this question, that then other animals might see that as the eyeballs of another wild animal?
I believe that's what is being asked.
Yes. Well, no one's ever run this experiment yet. So we don't know if that indeed would become an attractive to wildlife. But it would be something that during that experiment we could try to more fully understand.
So it might be like a perfect research
warning
question.
Fiber, but an attractant to other wildlife.
Okay, so at this point, Rob, I've set up our PowerPoint again if you'd like to move on to the next section, and again, we'll go back to the questions after.
Okay, and so when we say animal vehicle collisions, we mean there's two types, wildlife vehicle collisions and domestic animal vehicle collisions. And in my previous presentation, I always talked about animal vehicle collisions because quite often they're not separated out when we look at mitigation measures. And so we just completed a paper that was accepted 2 weeks ago in environmental management on this issue. And we piloted the state of Montana. They shared 10 years of animal vehicle collision data with us. And so I'm going to talk about these findings because some of them are quite interesting. So what we did was we tried to differentiate in space and time. Are there differences where, when I say domestic animals, it's primarily the large ones, so it's livestock. I'm going to probably call it livestock just for ease rather than domestic animal, and wildlife. So we tried to see if they were different locations and whether they were different time of year and time of day, for example. So we had 10 years of crash data from the state of Montana, and the state also separates domestic from wildlife. Some states do, some states don't. So we used that and we did some comparisons. And I know this is a complicated slide. The top left is the same as the bottom left. So it's just a histogram. It's called a polar histogram. It's the identical data to the data on the bottom. And so I'll just refer to the bottom left. And what you'll see is that the dark line is crashes with wildlife. And during the day, wildlife actually has two peaks, both at sunrise and sunset, in early evening and early morning. These also coincide with commuter times. But livestock, the white or gray line, you'll see only has one peak during the day. It's all at night. And so if you look at the bottom right figure, and you look at the far left bars, the white bar and the black bar, white again is livestock, dark is wildlife, you'll see that over 80% of all crashes in Montana, livestock crashes, are in the dark, but only 60% of wildlife. And if you look at dawn and dusk on that same slide, you'll see that wildlife have many more collisions at dawn, during the day, and at dusk compared to livestock collisions. So really when you're treating livestock collisions, it's a nighttime, primarily a nighttime phenomena, but with wildlife you have a couple peaks and you also have to deal with daytime collisions as well. Then when you look at the time of the year, as most wildlife, folks that know wildlife vehicle collisions, you have the spring and the fall spikes. A lesser one in the spring, that's called paturation, when the animals are fawning or having their young. And in the fall, a lot of the ungulates are in rut, and that's the highest spike. And so you'll see spring, fall on the black line with spikes. But again, with livestock, the spike is only in the fall. And this is in Montana. We think it might have to do, we're not sure, but it might have to do is when we start bringing animals down off of public land, rangelands, and they get down closer to the highways as the ranchers are gathering up the livestock off the open range. Then we looked at the spatial patterns. And so again, think of black as domestic and white as, black as wildlife and white as domestic. And so you can see in the east, Montana's the plains in the east, and the left third or the western third are the mountains. And again, there's more ranches and private land in the east and more national forests and public lands in the west. And so what we found was the western third of the state is where the mix is much more with wildlife vehicle collisions, but in the east it tends to be more livestock dominated, or a bigger mix with livestock. And then a couple things jump out. If you look at, let's see, it's the bottom middle one. You'll see one black county, and that is actually the Blackfeet Nation. Their reservation is 1.5 million acres, so it's a large part of that entire county, and it's the one county where domestic animal collisions, it's like 60% of all collisions. And so it's a very high mix. And some of the other ones where there's more domestic than wildlife, we found from these maps tended to be where the reservations were. And I'll talk about that later. But primarily the take-home message from this was the east has a higher mix of domestic animal collisions. The west has primarily wildlife collisions. And so there are implications because, for example, we said for some kinds of mitigation, you would want to deal with fencing along the road to keep cattle and and horses off the road, which is very different, and make it wildlife friendly so wildlife can jump over it, or a pronghorn can get under it. Or you could treat wildlife, which might be overpasses and underpasses with fencing. So you have different mitigation measures depending on the problem. And this is, again, where the Blackfeet Reservation really jumped out at us, where 60% of their collisions with animals are with livestock. And so we know there needs to be some future research on this, but we do want to dive into it a little deeper and also compare it to other states. So we have worked up a proposal to do so. And then the liability is the last issue, that open range versus closed areas, and is it the driver that pays during a collision, or is it the livestock owner? So there's some economic issues that go as well to the management implications. And so lastly, that got us thinking, and this wasn't published, we just did this recently, and we looked at it, and the bottom line, if you look at the bottom two lines, Montana reservation lands, Montana non-reservation lands, look at the percentage of animal vehicle collision, domestic versus livestock. So livestock collisions as a percent of all animal collisions in Montana are less than 6% when you're not on a reservation. When you're on a reservation, it jumps to over 19%. So you're three times more likely on a reservation road to hit livestock as you are to have a collision with wildlife. And some of the individual reservations, as you can see, up to 81% is with livestock. So the idea that we're treating animal vehicle collisions the same and not separating these two out, clearly in this statewide study shows we really need to pay attention to the different causes, the different type of animal vehicle collision. So that's basically the summary, and there's a lot more research to compare some of these different states. Are they all the same? There was one reservation that was the same as the rest of Montana. Why is that different than the other 8 reservations? So there's a lot to explore here. It's rich for some future looking into more deeply.
Perfect, thank you. And once again, if anyone has any questions, if you put them in the chat pod on the left-hand side, and we will get those addressed for you. The whole question that we have for you is why is it important to differentiate between crashes with livestock and wildlife? Is it livestock crashes can be locally abundant even if rare at a broader scale? Livestock crashes can be more dangerous to humans on a pre-collision basis. Optimal strategies for reducing collision risk may differ between livestock and wildlife. All of the above, none of the above, or I don't know and I don't remember. And so, Rob, because we do have so many questions, I am going to go ahead and ask you the next question. And that is, how about animal exclusive freeway overcrossings like I-405 in LA?
I'm sorry, could you ask that one more time about animal
exclusive? Of course. Animal exclusive freeway overcrossings like I-405 in LA.
Yes, so, right, so by animal, I'm not sure if they're differentiating livestock from wildlife.
So these questions are from the first section still, so it probably was before we had that discussion.
Oh, sorry. So exclusionary. I'm sorry. I'm missing the intent of this question.
I believe they're just asking about overcrossings and your opinion on those being a strategy for the animal exclusive ones. So no cars can use the overcrossings that go over the freeway, but the animals can. So just like the ones in Banff.
Oh, right. And by animal exclusive, it means people can't use them, bike, ped,
Correct.
but solely animals to get safely over a road. And so my understanding of Liberty Canyon, I believe, is what the 405 is in California, where they're designing an overpass across all 10 lanes. And so it is a strategy to reconnect. Clearly, some of these really busy roads are getting this kind of infrastructure to reconnect populations on both sides. We're starting to see a lot of our interstate highways. Nevada has a crossing, Utah on I-80, Washington on I-90. So some of our busiest 4, 6, up to 10 lanes now are being considered because of the needs for wildlife to be reconnected on both sides. So I agree with the strategy. I know the one in California is extremely expensive.
And that's similar to the next question. So it's asking, what is the biggest barrier to building new wildlife overpasses or underpasses? Is it funding, the awareness or efficacy, or federal policy supporting the construction?
Yeah, so federal policy is pretty open. You can use almost, I think it's like 6 different programs. The money is available. It doesn't mean you have to use it, so it's still competing interests. But policy is not a hindrance under the FAST Act. The other hindrance is always funding. Again, you're competing with mitigation dollars, are always competing with other needs, and there's no separate stream of funding for mitigation. So, and the second part is mitigation is primarily for safety, of course, because that's in the mission of the transportation agencies. However, sometimes it's needed for conservation purposes, which is usually the state wildlife agency, and so who don't have quite the money to make that to afford to pay for it fully for such structures or mitigation measures. So my understanding, and I've seen this happening across the country, is that partnerships are forming where there's sort of a shared investment for both safety and conservation.
In the first section that you spoke about, you talked about safe stopping distance, and someone is wondering what types of vehicles were studied to determine the safe stopping distance. I'm wondering if you know that.
Yeah, those are automobiles, is my understanding. I pulled that data from the Washington State DOT's manual for reaction time and for braking distance and reaction distance. And I think it was for vehicles, and it was for clear, dry days, dry pavement and clear visibility. So perfect conditions, in other words. It gets worse if it's winter.
I'm going to have you go ahead at this point and address the answers to the poll question, and then we'll move you on to the third section just to, again, make sure that you have enough time to finish presenting.
Right. So it looked at the 3 options where livestock crashes are locally abundant, which they are. Even if they're a small percent at the broader scale, that's why we have to dive into our data to see what's causing, what type of animal is in the causing the collisions. They are more dangerous. Horses and cattle tend to be bigger bodied, and moose are more problematic than deer versus pronghorn antelope. So body size makes a big difference on the severity of injuries to humans, to the amount of vehicle damage, et cetera. So they are often more dangerous than wildlife. And then the optimal strategy for reducing collisions may differ. For livestock, it might be lighting and fencing right-of-ways and enforcing when animals get out on the road and making the owners put them back behind the fence. while for wildlife, the mitigation measures might be wildlife crossings or animal detection driver warning systems. So they do have different strategies to reduce the collisions depending on if it's livestock or wildlife. So the answer is all of the above, and it looks like almost 73% of the folks answered the correct answer.
Perfect. Going to move you over to our presentation, and again, we'll go back to the questions as we have time after this next section, and any that we do not get to, we will provide answers with afterwards. So your presentation is all set if you'd like to move on to the third part, Rob.
Okay, so I want to look at last cost-benefit analysis. This was, again, something we set up over 10 years. We published it in 2009, and now we get to revisit it with the pooled fund study. That's another part of our task, is to come up with a cost-benefit analysis tool for state DOTs or other transportation agencies. And just to give you an idea what kind of global perspective, I guess, again, the U.S. numbers in column 1 were the ones I gave before, but we also have looked at Canada as part of our national study, and it is somewhat, they're always about 1/10 of the U.S., 1/10 of the people. So that's about where they come out. And then, of course, Europe, it is equally problematic with lots of human injuries, a lot of more fatalities, actually, than the U.S. on an annual basis. So this is, again, from our published study that we'll get to update. This is a 10-year-old look at what we looked at back then. And I'll talk about a little things, how we're going to refresh it and update it now. And so the average vehicle repair, these are in $07, came out to about $2,600 for deer. You can see it keeps going up because of the bigger bodies. The bigger mass causes more damage. Same with human injuries as well as fatalities. Moose are much more, cause more fatalities per accident on average than, say, a deer. And then maintenance costs, or I'm sorry, towing and removing the vehicle, et cetera. So the interesting thing that's highlighted here is the hunting value. This was such a conservative cost estimate of the average collision in the U.S. with deer, elk, and moose. We just used the hunting value. And that's one area we're going to update in our new study. And then, so also there was carcass removal costs. The bottom line was it's about $6,600 in this conservative estimate for the cost of a deer crash. An average elk crash is about 3 times as much, 17,000, over 17,000, and of course moose is nearly 5 times as much, primarily due to the body size. But now if you look at, if we were to have used restitution value, again, I'll go back, and it was $116, $397, and $387. But if you were to do what the states value their wildlife at, and I have other, there's been a compendium put together of all the states by, I think, the Teddy Roosevelt Conservation Partnership. So I'll be pulling, we'll be using those data as well. But just as an example for Wyoming, you can see a mule deer or whitetail deer is $4,000, not the hundreds of dollars for a license. Moose is $7,500. Bighorn sheep $15,000. Elk is $6,000. So you can see how conservative our original estimate is of the cost of a collision with the 3 major ungulates across the country. And then if you update those dollars to 2018, that's the bottom row. the $6,000 becomes $8,000 in 2018, $25,000 or $44,000 for a moose. So the collisions cost society quite a bit. I know that the payments, the paying of the mitigation measures is by the agency, but it is with public dollars. But the cost accruing to society when they get in these crashes is actually quite high. And so we looked at the cost of the mitigation measure itself and the percent in deer vehicle collision reductions. And you could see where good investments of the mitigation measure make sense and where they might not be such a wise investment of agency dollars. And so we red-lighted, yellow-lighted, and green-lighted based on relative effectiveness in reducing those collisions, but we also showed some of the costs to treat a kilometer, 0.6 mile per year for those treatments. And so you can see, you know, why agencies considered fences with overpasses expensive. It was one of the higher amounts. But even animal detection systems, you know, overpasses last for 75, are built for 75-year lifetime. ADS may last 10 to 15 years. So in that 75 years, you actually have to buy 5 systems. So that's why they ended up being actually over the life, over that 75-year horizon, the cost for ADS actually exceeded fences with overpasses. And so then we just said, well, what is the threshold? That is, when an agency pays for a mitigation measure, what kind of crash rates do they need to, quote unquote, break even for the cost of the damage that's been accruing to the drivers, to the owners of the vehicles, or what we say is to society. And so if you look at the numbers, again, these are kilometers per year for deer, but you could, just so you know, 3.2 is like 5.1 deer per mile per year. And fences and underpasses don't need very many collisions to pay for themselves over their 75-year lifespan. Similarly with even underpasses and overpasses. You can start seeing at what kind of crash rates where the investment in the mitigation measure structure is the same as if doing nothing. And that's what one has to remember, that if you have 3.2 deer collisions per kilometer per year, that is costing society over, say, $20,000 a year, every year, by not doing anything. But if you treat it to reduce it or make it disappear by investing in mitigation measures, it might be considered a good economic investment. And so we ran the numbers on a site that we knew had good data. And this is the Trans-Canadian Highway outside of the parks, Dead Man's Flat, appropriate name for it. But it had 6 years of data before, then a year to actually build the structure, and then 6 years of data post-construction. It was an underpass with 3 kilometers of fencing directing the animals to the underpass. And as you can see, the rates of the collisions on pre-construction, or the left 6 bars in this histogram, are quite high. And then once it was mitigated, they really dropped off. And so then we used those numbers and the species that were in the collisions and ran it through that cost-benefit analysis. And you can see the costs when they hadn't treated that highway was $128,000 every year. That's how much, due to the collision rates with those different species, from deer, elk, moose, bighorn sheep primarily. Then when you invested the $1 million for the underpass and then put in the fencing, so it was $1 to $2 million of investment, it dropped from 128,000 a year to less than 17,000 a year. So basically, you're saving over $100,000 a year on this site by putting in what many consider the expensive mitigation measure, crossing structures with fences and jump outs. And yet, you can see where if you're saving $100,000 a year and it's a 75, and it lasts for 75 years, fences are replaced every 25 years, and it includes the maintenance of these systems. It just is a wise investment just from an economic sense, let alone a safety sense. So we were able to run the numbers on a site-specific area that had been treated with good data. So in summary, even though WVCs are underreported, there are many highway segments today that you can make an economic case for the mitigation investment. And we know that even though there's more reasons to mitigate a highway for wildlife purposes than simply an economic one, for conservation value, for safety values, etc. And we also know that the agencies tend to pay for the mitigation, but the economic benefits accrue to the public. But nonetheless, before this study, very few people had an economic rationale. They could only do it for safety/conservation purposes. We hope this is just another part of a discussion in the decision-making process for when to mitigate and what type of mitigation measure makes sense. Thank you. And so this is just a summary. We want to remind the people that it is very a conservative estimate that we did. We're going to be updating it right now, adding more wrinkles into a more sophisticated cost-benefit analysis for the pooled fund study, and that we'll still probably be err to the lower side of costs, but nonetheless we'll add additional items into the new cost-benefit analysis. And so for some people, they do like to talk about costs, and so at least we have a tool available. And I think that is it. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Rob. And just due to the time frame, I am going to have you go ahead and talk about this slide as well that's now showing, Rob.
Oh, right. And so, of course, we want to acknowledge all the people and organizations that have either partnered with us or worked with us or supported our research.
Perfect. Thank you. So in today's webinar, we hope that you have learned to identify the 3 strategies developed to reduce animal vehicle collisions and the types of mitigation measures that fit under each strategy, to know which of the 28 countermeasures are most effective and which are not, to understand the importance of differentiating between crashes with livestock and wildlife, and to more fully appreciate the cost of doing nothing to mitigate animal vehicle collisions versus the benefits that accrue when countermeasures are deployed. Again, I do know that there are quite a few questions left in the chat pod. We will pull those out of the chat pod and have Rob answer them via paper. We will send them out to everyone who is registered for today's webinar, as well as posting them with the live webinar link once we have that posted to our website. Our upcoming webinars that we have for you is a speed management one on November 19th. We have a local road safety plan implementation webinar, part 1, December 5th, and part 2, December 17th. The local road safety plan ones will be in conjunction with the National LTAP Association. As always, just a reminder that we do have all of the webinars archived on our website. There are over 45 of them now, so we'd love for you to go take a look at any of the past ones. We'd also like to remind you to follow us on social media. We are on Facebook and LinkedIn and have been making a very concerted effort to share a lot of rural road safety resources with you there. And then I do just want to leave you with Rob's email address as well in case you have additional questions that were not put in the chat pod. But one more time, we will get those answered and send those back out to you. Thank you all for joining us today. And Rob, thank you so much for presenting. We had a great conversation and definitely a lot of interesting questions in the subject, so thank you so much. All right, everybody have a great afternoon. Thanks.